Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video from thinkchristianly.org which purports to explain how Christians should think about evolution. Hopefully they actually mean think, and they don't really mean stop thinking as soon as it looks like the Earth might not only be 6,000 years old. Let's take a look.
How should Christians think about evolution? It's one of those terms that kind of brings up a whole bunch of emotions, and there's a whole bunch of, I think, confusion, quite honestly, in the public square when we go to think about what is evolution, how should Christians think about it?
This is actually one of the main benefits of being an atheist. I don't have to wonder how to think about anything. I get to form my own conclusions based on the data. And if those conclusions turn out to be wrong, I haven't attached my identity to them, so changing them is no big deal. As a Christian, your identity is tied to your religion, and your conclusions have to fit that religion, or you would have an identity crisis. They're not fun. That's why so many religious people, including yours truly, have such a slow emergence from their religion. They feel like they're losing a piece of themselves by no longer believing, and that's a scary concept. As an atheist, I'm free to change my opinion on anything without it affecting who I am.
So one of the most important things that any of us can do is to define our terms, because there are few topics where definitions are as critical than when talking about evolution.
Oh, please, pretty please, let this be the one where someone finally gives a concrete definition for the word kind.
So, for example, evolution, the word basically means change over time.
A more scientific definition would be change in the genetic composition of a population during successive generations, often resulting in the development of new species. Change over time is a very broad definition that could apply to almost anything. Using that definition, phones have evolved. But I doubt you would accept the undeniable truth that phones have changed over time to be proof of evolution in biology. This is why definitions are important, but you have to be specific or it doesn't matter.
Well, that's not a controversial thing at all. There's no conflict there with Christianity whatsoever. That's really the word history.
Exactly. If you define something vaguely enough, there will be no conflict.
Right? So change over time is not controversial. Another way that people define evolution is this idea of adaptation within existing species.
Adaptation isn't a definition of evolution, it's a description of a part of evolution. If something mutates in a way that's favorable to its environment, it has adapted. Now, what determines if a mutation is favorable in an environment? Selection pressures. Environmental factors which cause animals with certain traits to have survival advantages over animals without those traits. For instance, since you have Darwin's finches up there, we'll use them as an example. These finches were isolated on different islands in the Galapagos. On the different islands, there were different sources for the birds to find food. The birds who had mutations that made obtaining food easier, say a long pointed beak for a bird whose main food source are seeds from cactus fruits, they were better fit for the environment and would have a greater survival advantage over birds without that mutation. The Galapagos finches evolved into 14 separate species, each with its own beak shaped specialized for the food available in their region of the Galapagos. This is all well within your first non-controversial definition of change over time.
Kind of like finch beaks that change whether or not it's a rainy season or a drought season. There's a slight variation that kind of oscillates back and forth.
Yes, the finch beaks do indeed change size depending on how wet or dry the season was. Droughts favor birds with shorter, more robust beaks than wet seasons do. Now imagine if the selection pressure wasn't seasonal, if it just kept going in one direction instead of moving back and forth. It doesn't take much thought to realize that that leads to macroevolution. But is that thinking Christianly?
Again, this isn't controversial. No Christian I know denies this idea of change within an existing species, or sometimes it's called microevolution.
No Christian disagrees with it, but did you know that macroevolution is just the result of several small microevolutions? There is no magical mechanism to stop evolution just before a new species evolves. The mechanism for macroevolution is the exact same as for microevolution. How do you tell where one ends and the other begins? Also, I notice you're using the word species now rather than kinds. Is that an admission that the biblical kind is a species? Or are you just trying to avoid associating kind with species because you know that speciation has been well documented at this point in human history?
Now, where there is problem, and where there is perceived conflict, and I think real conflict, is this idea of Darwinian evolution.
Variation within species is at the foundation of Darwinian evolution. Nothing about the theory of evolution would work if variation within species didn't work. So how exactly is Darwinian evolution a problem if you accept variation within species?
And Darwinian evolution really has two fundamental kind of foundational claims that it makes. The first is universal common descent.
Evolution does not rest on universal common descent, but that is where the evidence is pointing. There's a pretty cool paper I found titled The Physiology and Habitat of the Last Universal Common Ancestor, in which they managed to genetically track down 355 genes that were present in what is called LUCA, or Last Universal Common Ancestor. From these genes, they've been able to find that LUCA wasn't fully alive in the sense that we would think of life today, and it probably lived near a hydrothermal vent in the ocean. Now that being said, even if there were several lines of descent, evolution still applies. Common descent is just where the evidence points.
The second pillar of Darwinism is natural selection acting on random mutation is sufficient to produce all of the complexity and diversity of life that we see.
That's not a pillar holding evolution up. That's a conclusion drawn from the fact that evolution is the mechanism which has resulted in the complexity and diversity of life we see. You yourself admitted that natural selection happens. Can you not see how extrapolating that over billions of years could result in all the complexity and diversity that we have today? And don't give me the old mutations never add information line. We see mutations that do that all the time. Gene duplication is a very common mutation, and one which leaves the second gene free to mutate and evolve separate functions from the first gene without impeding the performance of the first, because it's still there performing its original task.
And again, that's a pretty sweeping claim. Richard Dawkins has called this the blind watchmaker thesis.
Richard Dawkins has authored a book called The Blind Watchmaker, but I don't recall him ever calling it the Blind Watchmaker thesis, and the only websites I found mentioning it with that title were creationist websites. This stinks of straw man. Now, it's been a while since I read his book, but as I recall, it was mostly Dawkins' answer to the teleological argument, in which he shows evidence for there not being a designer. The subtitle of the book, after all, is Why the Evidence of Evolution Reveals a Universe Without Design.
And it's kind of the sweeping claim that Darwinism explains all of life, the diversity, the appearance of design, everything else.
The appearance of design is based in ignorance. The closer you look at life, the more clear it becomes that it was not designed. There are way too many inefficiencies and design flaws to go into here, but I'll touch on some of my favorites. First being the laryngeal nerve, which goes from the brain to the throat by way of the aortic arch in the chest, which is inefficient in humans but utterly ridiculous in giraffes. The optic nerve crossing the retina and causing a blind spot, the muscles that we have for moving our ears, wisdom teeth, the lack of ability for primates, including humans, to synthesize vitamin C, which is an ability found in almost all other animals and plants, but for some reason the gene was switched off in the Haplorini clade. Side note, this is also evidence that we are indeed apes. Why would God create a gene for synthesizing vitamin C, give this gene to all creatures, but switch it off in all the great apes and then make a non-ape human in the image of God, but which also shares a significant portion of its genetic material with the other apes, including the gene for synthesizing vitamin C, but also switched off? This is precisely the kind of thing we would expect to find if we were the products of billions of years of mutations guided by natural selection, but not at all what we would expect to see if an all-knowing, all-powerful genius designed us.
And there is a conflict there with Christianity because the Bible teaches and Christianity teaches that a purposeful God created and designed intentionally.
So what exactly was his intention when he gave us the gene for synthesizing vitamin C, but had switched it off permanently? What was his purpose in having the laryngeal nerve take such a huge detour? Was Jackson Pollock God, and this stuff is just the randomness that he shat out?
Whereas Darwinian evolution, that third part of that definition we mentioned, says basically a randomness, and that idea is all there is.
No, it does not. The mutations themselves are random, but which mutations are successful is determined by the selection pressures. It's not random that the creatures that are good at surviving in deserts tend to evolve in deserts.
Sometimes Christians want to bring up this idea of theistic evolution. Is that compatible?
I would say no, which is one of the main reasons I'm no longer a Christian. Too much evidence for evolution, not enough evidence for the claims of the Bible. But if you can make that work for you, then go for it. I'd much rather have people supporting science and saying that evolution was guided by God, rather than people saying we need to deny the science altogether.
Well, first, again, we want to define our terms. First, we'd want to ask, is there good independent evidence for Darwinian evolution in the first place?
I thought you said we were defining terms first. Looking for evidence is not defining terms. Now, that being said, yes, there is plenty of evidence. Go on.
Because we don't want to merge something with Christianity if there's no good evidence for it.
So, what evidence do you have for Christianity? None outside the Bible? Why the double standard?
So we want to examine that. And there's a lot of well-trained PhD scientists at MIT and different places in Georgia and elsewhere who seriously question that idea of Darwinian evolution.
Do you want to maybe start citing sources here? I mean, I'm not surprised at all that you could find an evolution-denying PhD in Georgia, but who's your guy at MIT? I mean, I could see one of the signatories who got duped into signing that scientific descent from Darwinism thing a while ago being from MIT, but that thing's a joke. The wording on it is basically, will you be a good scientist and be skeptical of claims and think examination of evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged? What scientist wouldn't agree with that if they didn't know it was coming from a creationist organization who would attach their names to it forever as evolution deniers, even though several dozen of them have officially requested that their name be removed?
Second thing is this idea that you could take a purposeless process and merge it with a purposeful God, and that's a contradiction.
Why? I mean, evolution itself does not have a purpose, but if God intended for humans to be the result all along, why couldn't he have influenced the selection pressures in a way that favored the development of humans? I mean, that makes a lot more sense than him designing us with all the same characteristics of apes, but somehow not being actual apes.
So I think theistic evolution has a lot of problems with it, and I think you'd want to clearly define your terms, because if you're talking about a random process, you're not talking about something that's distinctively Christian, because you have a purposeful God who from the beginning created on purpose and intentionally.
Yeah, but he sure went to a lot of trouble to make it look like he didn't create with a purpose or intentionally. I guess he just really wants us to believe not only without evidence, but in spite of evidence. He sounds like a great guy. Now that's it for this video. Remember to follow me on Twitter and support me on Patreon. See you next time.